Listen closely. I'm about to tell you something they buried with the last honest philosopher. Something that crawls beneath the silk sheets of every love story ever sold to you. There's a moment, perhaps you felt it, when a beautiful woman enters a room and every man's spine reorganizes itself into a question mark. Not from desire, understand, but from something older. Something that smells like wet earth and tastes like copper pennies held too long under the tongue. The Greeks had a word for it. Kalos kagathos, the beautiful and the good, married like conjoined twins sharing a single poisoned heart. But here's what Plato never admitted while he was busy sketching his cave shadows. Beauty is the first tyrant we meet, and we crown it ourselves, thread by golden thread, until we're wrapped so tight we mistake the bondage for an embrace. I knew a man once, let's call him Marcus, though that wasn't his name, and he wasn't quite a man anymore when I met him. He'd spent 17 years chasing a woman whose cheekbones could cut glass, and whose laugh sounded like champagne bubbles breaking against crystal. She never loved him. She loved what his love did to the mirror when she looked into it. Every morning, he'd wake up and polish his chains, convinced they were wings. The grotesque comedy of it all is that beauty doesn't even need to try. It sits there like a Venus flytrap dressed in Chanel No. 5, and we crawl toward it, dragging our dignity behind us like a broken leg. Schopenhauer called it the will to life, making fools of us all. Nature's cruel joke, dressing up reproduction as romance, hanging tinsel on our biological imperatives until we forget we're just moths mistaking a house fire for the moon. But here's where it gets interesting. Where Machiavelli's ghost starts laughing in that way that sounds like autumn leaves being crushed underfoot. The beautiful don't rule because they're powerful. They rule because we've already genuflected before they even notice we exist. We've constructed entire civilizations around this genuflection. Instagram is just a digital cathedral where we light votive candles under filtered selfies, praying to algorithms that learned our weakness before we learned our worth. There's an old Romanian folktale about a prince who fell in love with a woman made entirely of morning mist. Every dawn, he'd try to embrace her, and every dawn, she'd dissolve through his fingers, leaving nothing but damp palms and the smell of rain that never comes. By the story's end, he's aged 40 years in 40 days. His hair white as bird bones, still reaching for vapor, still believing that tomorrow she'll solidify. You're doing it right now, aren't you? Thinking of someone. That face that reorganized your molecular structure the first time you saw it. The one that made you betray yourself in 1,000 small ways, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, pretending to like music that sounded like cats being strangled. Convincing yourself that emotional unavailability was just mysterious depth. A 2024 study from the University of Copenhagen found that men in the presence of highly attractive women showed decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making. We literally become stupider in the presence of beauty. Not metaphorically, measurably. Our IQ points drip out of us like melting ice cream in July heat. And the cruelest part? The absolute pinnacle of this dark comedy? Beauty fades, always, without exception. It's a monarchy with a built-in expiration date, and yet we pledge our allegiance to it as if it were eternal. We're serving a dying king, and we know it, and we serve anyway. Because the alternative, looking at ourselves without the distraction of someone else's splendor, is a mirror we're not ready to face. I remember the exact moment I understood this. 3 a.m, Brooklyn, 2019. The woman I'd been orbiting like space debris for 2 years had just told me she was getting married. To someone else, naturally. I sat there in my apartment, surrounded by books I'd bought because she mentioned them once. Wearing a shirt she said brought out my eyes. She was lying. And I laughed. Not the healthy kind. The kind that sounds like glass breaking in reverse. Because I realized I'd never once asked myself if I actually liked her. I'd only asked if she liked me. The Sufis have a saying, "The beloved is the veil between you and God." But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the beloved is just a veil between you and yourself. And what's behind it isn't divinity. It's the terrifying possibility that you might be enough, alone, without anyone's beauty to validate your existence. So here's my question for you, whispered like a secret you shouldn't know. What would you become if you stopped kneeling? Not to beauty, not to desire, not to the tyranny of perfect cheekbones and practiced smiles. What kingdom would you build from the rubble of your genuflection? Don't answer yet. Let it rot inside you like fruit left too long in summer heat. Let it ferment into something honest. We dig through the ruins of departed lovers like archaeologists who've forgotten they're excavating their own graves. There's a peculiar species of madness that only visits at 3:47 a.m. It tastes like black coffee gone cold and sounds like your phone screen illuminating in the darkness. Not from a message, but from you checking, again, if they've seen your story, if they've posted anything, if they still exist in the same universe where you're slowly unraveling like a sweater caught on a nail. Let me tell you about the most pathetic thing I've ever done. No. Wait. Let me tell you about the second most pathetic thing, because the first still makes my teeth hurt from clenching. I once drove 4 hours to eat at a restaurant I despised, in a city that smelled like disappointment and sulfur, just because she'd posted a photo there with someone whose hand was visible in the frame. Just a hand. Male. Wearing a watch I couldn't afford. I sat in that restaurant, ordered salmon that tasted like regret, and tried to divine the future from the way her water glass had left rings on someone else's table. Kierkegaard wrote that the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. But old Soren was only half right. The most painful state is performing autopsies on relationships that died while you were still planning the wedding in your head. It's CSI, Heartbreak Unit, and you're simultaneously the detective, the corpse, and the murderer. We've turned stalking into a science so refined it would make the Stasi weep with envy. Digital breadcrumbs leading nowhere except deeper into our own labyrinth. Her Spotify playlist titled Moving On played on repeat. You know, because you check it hourly. His Instagram following count increased by 1. Who is she? The WhatsApp last seen that becomes a schedule you memorize better than your own heartbeat. Here's what the oracle at Delphi would say if she had a Twitter account. Know thyself, but first, know their every movement, their coffee order, their mother's maiden name, and whether they still sleep on the left side of the bed. A neuroscientist in Tokyo published a paper in 2024 showing that the same neural pathways activated during cocaine withdrawal light up when we check an ex's social media. We're addicts, but our dealer is absence itself. We're mainlining emptiness, shooting up shadows, getting high on the ghost of something that probably never existed the way we remember it. The Japanese have a word, tsundoku, for books you buy but never read, letting them pile up unread. But what's the word for screenshots you take but never send? For messages you type and delete, until your thumb develops a specific kind of arthritis that orthopedic surgeons will someday name after this generation? What's the word for rehearsing conversations with someone who's already forgotten your middle name? I'll tell you a secret that would make Machiavelli himself squirm. The prince who maintains power through fear is an amateur compared to the ex-lover who maintains power through absence. Presence can be fought, argued with, reasoned against. but absence. Absence is a God that accepts all prayers and answers none. There's a man in Prague who's been visiting his ex-girlfriend's grave every day for 43 years. She's not dead. The grave is empty. He bought the plot after she left him, had a headstone made with her name and the date she stopped loving him. He brings fresh flowers to this monument to nothing, this marble testimony to his refusal to move forward. When asked why, he says, "At least here I know where she is." So we laugh at him, but we're all curating museums to our own rejections. That shirt you won't wash because it still smells like their perfume. The text thread you won't delete because scrolling up is time travel and you're homesick for a country that evicted you. The playlist titled "For You" that you still update weekly, even though they blocked you 6 months ago. Here's what they don't tell you about moving on. It's not a destination, it's a deportation. You're being expelled from a country you thought was home. And every memory is contraband you're trying to smuggle through customs. The Buddhists say attachment is the root of all suffering. But the Buddhists never had to see their ex posting sunset photos from Santorini with someone who looks like you but successful. The Buddhists never experienced the specific hell of the hearts, and 47 others liked this notification. Where you know, one of those hearts belongs to that person from their office they swore was just a friend. Modern archaeology uses ground-penetrating radar to find buried civilizations. We use red receipts and activity status to excavate relationships that should have stayed buried. We're not moving on. We're moving in circles, each orbit slightly more degraded than the last, like a satellite slowly falling back to Earth. And perhaps that's the cruelest joke of all. In an age where forgetting has become impossible, where every moment is archived and searchable, we've lost the mercy of amnesia. We can't heal because we won't let the wound close. We keep picking at the scab, checking if it still bleeds, disappointed when it doesn't, devastated when it does. So here's my challenge to you. Delivered like a diagnosis you already knew was coming. Delete them. I don't mean block them. That's just another form of attention. I mean delete them from your device, from your search history, from the muscle memory in your thumb. Stop being an archaeologist of your own pain. Stop digging. The artifacts you're finding aren't treasure. They're just bones, and they're your own. But you won't, will you? Because the absence has become more real than any presence ever was. Because you're in love with a ghost, and ghosts don't leave fingerprints. Don't ask for space, don't disappoint you by being human. The real question isn't whether you can let go. It's whether you can admit you're holding on to nothing. Solitude isn't the absence of others. It's the presence of yourself. And most men would rather die than meet that stranger. Have you ever noticed how silence has a weight? Not metaphorically, physically. It presses against your eardrums like deep water, makes your bones ache in places you didn't know had nerves. I discovered this at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday that could have been any Tuesday, sitting in an apartment so quiet I could hear my neighbor's cat thinking about existentialism 3 floors up. Here's what nobody tells you about choosing solitude. It's not peaceful. It's feral. It has teeth. The first week alone, truly alone, not alone but texting, not alone but scrolling, but carved from the world alone. Your mind turns into a Victorian orphanage where all the children are your repressed thoughts, and they're all screaming at once. The hermits knew something we've forgotten in our terror of being alone with ourselves. There's a 12th century manuscript hidden in a monastery in Mount Athos that describes the stages of voluntary isolation. First comes the hunger, not for food, but for witness. You do something mundane, like cooking an egg, and realize no one will ever know you cooked that egg. That egg exists in a universe population. 1. It's Schrödinger's breakfast, simultaneously significant and meaningless. Then comes the negotiations. Your mind becomes a used car salesman desperate to close a deal. Just one text, it whispers. Just check if anyone's noticed you're gone. What if there's an emergency? What if she finally realized what she lost? But here's the savage truth. No one notices. The emergency is that there is no emergency. She's not realizing anything except maybe that her coffee order is simpler now that you're not there asking for oat milk. I once spent 40 days without speaking to another human being. Not as some spiritual quest. I'm not that pretentious. I just wanted to see what would happen when I stopped performing myself for an audience. By day 7, I was having full conversations with a spider in my bathroom. By day 14, the spider was winning the arguments. By day 21, I realized the spider had been dead the entire time. But then something shifts. Around day 25, the screaming stops. Not gradually, suddenly, like someone pulled the plug on an amp mid-guitar solo. And in that silence, that real silence, you meet someone you've been avoiding your entire life. Yourself, without costume, without script, without audience. He's uglier than you thought, and more beautiful, and definitely stranger. Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." But what he didn't mention is that the chaos feels like your organs rearranging themselves, like your skeleton trying to crawl out of your skin to escape the honesty of solitude. There's a psychological phenomenon discovered in 2024 called social phantom limb syndrome. When people who've never been alone suddenly are, they report physical sensations of missing body parts. Their brain literally cannot compute existing without external validation, so it invents pain to fill the void. We've become so dependent on others' perception that we cease to exist without witnesses. The monks of Skellig Michael lived on a rock in the Atlantic, 600 feet above the sea, accessible only by stone steps carved into the cliff face. They chose this. They chose wind that could flay skin from bone, chose winters where the sun forgot to rise, chose a life where their only company was God and puffins. And I'm not convinced about God. But here's what they knew that we've forgotten. In true solitude, you stop being who you think you are and start being who you are. The performance ends. The mask doesn't slip. It disintegrates. And what's underneath isn't pretty or ugly, good or evil. It just is. I met a man in Reykjavik who hadn't left his apartment in 3 years. Not agoraphobia, choice. He said, "Every time I went outside, I became someone else's idea of me. I got tired of auditioning for the role of myself." His apartment was immaculate. His mind was a cathedral. His eyes were terrifying in their clarity. The paradox that would make Machiavelli weep. The prince who needs no one rules everything, starting with himself. But the price of that crown is accepting that you might be unlovable, not because you're unworthy, but because love requires performance, and you've retired from the stage. There's an ancient Chinese practice called sitting and forgetting, Zuo Wang. You sit until you forget your name, your history, your future, your needs. You sit until you're just consciousness observing itself, like a mirror reflecting another mirror into infinity. Most people try it for 10 minutes and run screaming back to their phones, their people, their precious distractions. Because here's the thing about genuine solitude. It's not an escape from others. It's a confrontation with the void where your personality used to be. It's realizing that most of what you call yourself is just a collection of other people's expectations, wearing your face like a Halloween mask. The COVID lockdowns gave us a taste, but we cheated. We Zoomed, we texted, we created elaborate performances of productivity and connection. We did everything except the one thing that terrifies us more than death: existing without an audience. Last month, I sat in a sensory deprivation tank for 4 hours, floating in salt water, in absolute darkness, in silence so complete I could hear my neurons firing. And you know what I discovered? The person I am when no one's watching doesn't need love, doesn't need validation, doesn't need anything except the curious pleasure of existing. He also doesn't need to exist. That's the liberation and the terror of true solitude. You realize you're optional. Everything is optional. And in that optionality, in that vast indifference, is a freedom so pure it feels like falling upward into space. So here's my whisper in the dark, my dare wrapped in velvet and thorns. Can you spend 7 days alone? Not alone-ish. Alone. No texts, no calls, no posts, no performing your aloneness for others. Just you and the stranger you've been avoiding in the mirror. Most of you will find excuses. Work, family, obligations, the beautiful chains you've forged to avoid this meeting. But a few of you, the dangerous ones, the ones who've been feeling the walls of consensus reality getting thin, you'll try it. And you'll either go mad or go home. And sometimes they're the same place. Every man collects wounds like currency, but nobody tells you that trauma is a cryptocurrency, volatile, speculative, and worthless the moment you try to cash it in for love. She said I tasted like goodbye. This was 3 drinks into a conversation that started with, "We need to talk," and would end with me walking home at 4 a.m., counting the cracks in the sidewalk like rosary beads. But it wasn't the leaving that taught me something. It was what she said next. "You wear your damage like cologne. I could smell it from across the room the night we met." We've become merchants in the economy of suffering, haven't we? Trading war stories over whiskey, comparing scars like business cards. You think that's bad? Wait till you hear about my childhood. That's nothing. My ex-wife took the dog and my capacity for trust. We're all competing in the trauma Olympics, but nobody told us that all the medals are made of rust. There's a bazaar in Marrakesh where they sell broken pottery repaired with gold, kintsugi, stolen from the Japanese and commercialized for tourists who want their damage to look pretty. But here's what the merchants won't tell you. The gold is paint, the breaks are manufactured, and the whole thing is a performance of authenticity that costs 40 euros and falls apart in the rain. That's what we've done with our wounds. Painted them gold, put them on display, convinced ourselves that being broken makes us interesting. Spoiler alert from someone who's been shattered and reassembled more times than a crash test dummy. It doesn't. Schopenhauer said we're all porcupines huddling for warmth in winter. Get too close and we pierce each other, too far and we freeze. But what he missed is that some of us have started sharpening our quills on purpose, have made weapons of our wounds, have turned "I'm damaged" into both pickup line and exit strategy. I knew a man, let's call him Vincent, because he painted his pain in broad strokes across every conversation, who introduced himself at parties by listing his psychiatric medications. "Hi, I'm Vincent. Lexapro, Wellbutrin, with a Xanax chaser when the existential dread gets too thick." He thought honesty was the same as intimacy. He thought bleeding was the same as being seen. He died alone, which wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was that he died performing alone for an audience he'd driven away with his one-man show titled, "Look How Beautifully I Bleed." There's a phrase in modern psychology that makes me laugh in that way that sounds like choking: trauma bonding. As if wound recognizes wound across a crowded room, as if scar tissue has its own magnetic field. We've convinced ourselves that shared damage is the same as connection, that comparing crutches is the same as dancing. But here's the dark mathematics of it all. Two people drowning don't make one person swimming. They just make the drowning more intimate. A 2025 Stanford study found that people who lead with their trauma in dating profiles get 67% more initial messages, but 89% fewer second dates. We're fascinated by damage the way we're fascinated by car crashes. We slow down to look, but we don't stop to help. The truth that Machiavelli would appreciate if he'd lived in the age of therapy speak and Instagram infographics about healing journeys. Your wounds are not your worth. Your trauma is not your personality. Your damage is not your destiny. But we've built an entire culture around the opposite premise, haven't we? Every dating app profile, looking for someone who can handle my anxiety/depression, trust issues/attachment style/emotional unavailability. We're advertising our malfunction like it's a feature, not a bug. Swipe right if you can fix me might as well be the motto of modern romance. I once dated a woman who kept a journal of every way she'd been wronged since childhood. Not metaphorically, literally. A leather-bound ledger of grievances, cross-referenced by date, perpetrator, and category of harm. She'd read from it during arguments, citing page numbers. This is just like what my mother did on March 15, 2003, see page 247, subsection C. She called it processing. I called it building a monument to misery and charging admission. The Tibetans have a practice where they build elaborate sand mandalas, intricate and beautiful, then destroy them to demonstrate impermanence. We've done the opposite. We've built permanent monuments to temporary pain. We've made museums of our mistakes. We've turned our hearts into historic sites where the same battle is reenacted daily for tourists who stopped caring 3 heartbreaks ago. Here's what your therapist won't tell you because they need the repeat business. At some point, you have to stop being a victim of your story and become the author. At some point, you have to stop collecting wounds and start collecting life. At some point, you have to realize that your trauma is boring, not to minimize your pain, but to maximize your potential. The oak tree doesn't spend its life talking about the lightning strike that split it. It just grows around the scar, reaches for light, drops acorns. It doesn't join a support group for electrically traumatized trees. It doesn't write poetry about its burns. It just continues being a tree, scarred but not scared. Last week, I met a woman at a bookstore. She was reading Pessoa, which should have been my first warning sign. Anyone reading Portuguese poets at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday is running from something. We talked for an hour. Not once did she mention an ex, a disorder, a childhood wound, a therapeutic breakthrough. Not once did she bleed on me and call it conversation. Later, I realized why it felt so strange. She was present, not performing her past, not advertising her damage, not trying to bond through mutual dysfunction, just present, like a cat in sunlight, existing without apology or explanation. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. It was like meeting an adult in a world full of children comparing their scraped knees. So here's my question, asked like a doctor checking for reflexes. What would you be if you weren't your wounds? Who would you introduce yourself as if you couldn't mention your damage? What would you talk about if trauma was off the table? The silence that follows that question. That's where your life actually lives. Everything else is just scar tissue talking. The highest throne a man can reach is the one where he needs neither crown nor subjects. But the view from there is so clear It's blinding. The last woman I loved asked me what I wanted, and I couldn't answer. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. Neither of us was smoking, and in that silence I heard something crack. Not my heart. That had broken so many times it was basically held together with emotional duct tape and spite. What cracked was the performance. The show was over, the audience had left, and I was standing on an empty stage realizing I'd forgotten there was a world beyond the footlights. Nothing, I finally said, and I meant it the way monks mean it when they take vows, the way the desert means it when it refuses rain. She left, of course. People always leave when you stop feeding them the drama they've grown accustomed to dining on. But here's the secret that would make Machiavelli himself genuflect. The power isn't in making them stay. The power is in not needing them to. There's a man in Kyoto who hasn't spoken in 37 years. Not a vow of silence. He simply ran out of things worth saying. He makes tea, tends his garden, watches clouds. Tourists come from around the world to sit with him, to absorb his silence like it's medicine. They project profundity onto his quietude, but the truth is simpler and more terrible. He's not wise, he's just done. Done performing, done explaining, done needing to matter. The French have a phrase, l'appel du vide, the call of the void. That urge you get standing on a cliff to jump, not from depression, but from possibility. But there's another void, one that calls not from edges, but from centers. The void where your need for validation used to live. The void where your desperate grasping for love used to echo. The void that, once you stop fearing it, becomes a throne. A neuroscientist in Stockholm discovered in 2024 that the brains of people who've truly let go show activity patterns similar to those in deep meditation, but also similar to those in the moments before death. The ego doesn't dissolve. It simply stops insisting on its own importance. It's like background music you suddenly realize you can turn off. Nietzsche wrote, "God is dead," and everyone clutched their pearls. But the real obituary he was writing was for the need to matter to someone, anyone, even an invisible sky father. When God dies, what dies with him is the desperate need to be seen, to be judged, to be loved. What remains is just existence, pure and purposeless and perfect in its purposelessness. I'll tell you about the moment I achieved what the Buddhists call enlightenment, and what I call exhaustion. It was a Wednesday. It's always a Wednesday when your world ends. Have you noticed? I was sitting in a cafe in Berlin, watching rain hit windows like drunk texts from the universe, when I realized I hadn't checked my phone in 3 hours. Not from discipline, from disinterest. No one I wanted to hear from. Nothing I wanted to say. No performance I wanted to give. The liberation was so sudden I laughed, startling a pigeon that had been contemplating stealing my croissant. But it wasn't happy laughter. It was the laugh of someone who realizes they've been holding their breath for 40 years and suddenly doesn't remember why. There's a species of jellyfish, Turritopsis dohrnii, that's immortal. When it reaches the end of its life cycle, it simply reverts to polyp stage and starts over. But here's what marine biologists don't put in the nature documentaries. It loses everything, all memory, all experience, all accumulated self. It continues, but it's not the same creature. It's immortal at the cost of everything that made it itself. That's what letting go really means. Not moving on. Metamorphosis. Not healing. Transformation so complete that the wounded version of you becomes a stranger you once knew. The Roman Stoics had a practice called memento mori. Remember, you must die. But they missed the more profound meditation. Remember, you don't have to matter. Remember, significance is optional. Remember that the universe was fine before you, and will be fine after you, and is, in fact, fine right now while you're desperately trying to carve your initials into its indifference. Last month I deleted everything. Not just social media, everything. Photos, messages, emails going back 15 years. Every digital proof that I had been loved, been seen, been someone. It took 4 hours, and when it was done, I sat in my apartment looking at blank screens and felt something I'd never felt before. Complete. Not happy, not sad. Complete. Like a sentence that finally found its period. The mystical traditions all point to the same door, whether they call it enlightenment, gnosis, or union with the divine. But none of them tell you what's actually behind that door. Nothing. And not the terrifying nothing of nihilism, but the liberating nothing of space, room to breathe, room to be, room to not be. I still walk through the world. I still drink coffee that's too expensive and sometimes tastes like burnt ambition. I still occasionally catch myself in mirrors and wonder who that stranger is wearing my face. But I don't need anything from any of it anymore. Not love, not recognition, not even understanding. The throne is empty because I am the throne. The crown is absent because I am the crown. The kingdom doesn't exist because I am the kingdom. Population, 0. And that 0 contains everything. So here's my final question, whispered like a benediction or a curse, depending on your readiness to hear it. What if you're already enough? What if you've always been enough? What if the whole performance, the whole desperate dance for love and validation and meaning, what if it was all unnecessary? What if you could just stop, not stop existing, stop needing to matter, stop needing to be loved, stop needing to leave a mark? What if you could just be, like a tree is, like a mountain is, like the silence between heartbeats is? Most of you will recoil from this possibility like it's death itself. And in a way it is. It's the death of everything you thought you were, everything you thought you needed. But on the other side of that death, nothing. And it's magnificent.